Welcome to Afternoon Briefing. Greg Jennett with you this Thursday here in Parliament House on Ngunnawal country. And as usual, Fran Kelly's with us in Sydney on the land of the Gadigal people. Great to see you back again today, Fran. Why don't we go to the High Court first of all, just when that cackle of Liberal infighting in New South Wales appeared to have died down a little, which would have given clearer air for Scott Morrison's run towards calling the election. We learned this afternoon, Fran, that the High Court's agreed to at least consider an application from a disgruntled former, expelled Liberal Party member from New South Wales. How does this complicate the calculation in the countdown to the election?
Well, I guess it just delays it a little, doesn't it? So the High Court, as you say, will hear this application from Matthew Kamanzuli. He was the New South Wales Liberal Party executive member who sought leave to appeal. He was beaten earlier in the week, which seemed as though it was all go for the Prime Minister. His captain's picks of 12 candidates were allowed to stand and he could call the election now. The High Court's going to look at this again tomorrow as this challenge goes forward. If it agrees to hear it, that will delay things even further. But as you say, Mr Kamanzuli has been chucked out of the Liberal Party, which I'm hearing on the grapevine some Liberal Party members think is a bit of a heavy-handed response for this. I mean, why shouldn't someone be able to challenge the Prime Minister's captain picks or the right to make them? But anyway, that's where things stand. So it's just another fly in the ointment. I'm not sure. I don't think in constitutional terms it necessarily needs to hold Scott Morrison's election timetable back, because I think parties have 10 days once the election's called before they have to finalise the names on the ballot. So just in those terms, I think it's all okay, still green light for the Prime Minister, but it just looks very untidy. Yeah,
and I think, Fran, some of the court watchers, regular High Court watchers, have already observed an apparent reluctance on the part of the Chief Justice last week to want to take this case on. But anyway, they've got it to the point where they could at least consider it tomorrow afternoon and will do so. As for Scott Morrison, well, why don't we hear from his own mouth when he was, not for the first time, asked earlier today, before this High Court development, exactly what his election timing options might be now.
We're going to do this every day. The election will be called when, I'm in a position to go to the Governor-General. It's almost 3 years, and by mid-May, from the last election, I said we would run a term, do the job, and go to the Australian people. And so that's when the election is due, and I think we'll be calling it soon.
Soon, whatever that means, Fran. And because we're deeply into the pre-campaign campaign, we're already starting to see what can happen in the many unscripted moments when voters decide to take up their cause directly with roaming politicians. I guess this has been one constant that politicians just factor into their campaigns when they take their goods to market, Fran.
I guess they do. It's the, there's a very famous incident, wasn't there, with Bob Hawke on a campaign trail and a, quote, silly old bugger. But, so they're used to it. They know it's going to happen. The great thing about Australian campaigns is that the leaders do walk through places, do walk through shopping centres, do walk into pubs. But as every time they do, of course, they have to be ready for the unscripted moment, the disgruntled, plenty of fans always, plenty of babies, plenty of koalas or whatever it is. They love that. But it's the disgruntled voters that make it tricky for them. A little later in the program, I'm going to be talking to some pretty experienced campaign strategists about, how much of a danger, how dangerous these kind of moments are. In Scott Morrison's case, a very grumpy voter accosted him in a pub and talked about broken promises. Anthony Albanese, he had an incident yesterday where he was having an open-air press conference and someone bowled up and said, "I want to ask you a tough question. Will you take the tough question?" And, we'll have a look at how the leaders can deal with these things, how these two leaders deal with these respective incidents, and who's perhaps most at risk of this. Anthony Albanese is an inexperienced campaigner as leader. He's never been through this before. Scott Morrison perhaps forged in fire last time around. So is that a drawback or a danger for Anthony Albanese? We'll talk about that a little later.
Yeah, looking forward to that. Why don't we give the last word on this point, Fran, to Anthony Albanese himself. As you say, he was confronted, you wouldn't put it any more strongly than that, yesterday by a gentleman who wanted to ask him questions. This was his observation about this phenomenon of campaigning earlier today.
I think that people should engage politely wherever possible, and it is important in this country that we're able to have civil discourse.
All right, so back to Fran with more in just a moment, but let's quickly now recap the main stories of the day for you. A High Court drama. The bench agrees to hear a case tomorrow brought by an ousted Liberal Party member in the ongoing factional brawl within that branch. Deport the diplomats. Labor leaps ahead of the government, demanding a partial purge of Vladimir Putin's embassy envoys here in Australia. And manners, please. Political leaders confronted by voters ask for respectful encounters on the winding campaign trail that'll lead to Election Day.
Well, as we've been discussing, the New South Wales Liberal Party's pre-selection row will be back in the High Court tomorrow. It's a challenge to the Prime Minister's intervention in candidate selection in that state. One of those candidates is the federal MP for North Sydney, Trent Zimmerman. Trent Zimmerman, welcome to Afternoon Briefing.
Thanks for having me, Fran. Great to be back in the studio.
So when is the Prime Minister going to call the election? Am I going to be called into work on the weekend?
Well, look, it is a matter of days, so I think we can be patient for a little bit longer, and we know it'll be mid-May, so we just have to be a little bit patient for a few more days and a few more hours.
Why do we, though? What's the hold-up? Is it to do with this High Court challenge, this pre-selection challenge?
Well, look, the calling of an election is uniquely for any Prime Minister their responsibility, and I think it's pretty clear that it's going to be one of 2 weekends in May, so and the campaign's effectively underway, so I think we can get a little bit hang up about the day on which he goes to Yarralumla, but I don't think we've got long to wait.
All right. The High Court has agreed to hear the challenge to the Prime Minister's right to intervene in state pre-selections. To quote the New South Wales Premier Dominic Perrottet, it's a bit of a debacle, isn't it? All this at such a last minute.
Well, it's been enormously frustrating for me as a potential candidate and now the candidate, and there will obviously be lessons that we need to look at on the other side of the election. But we've had a decision of the New South Wales Court of Appeal which upheld the actions that the federal executive of the party took. It's the right of an applicant in this case to go to the High Court. I assume that they will resolve it very quickly. But from my perspective, I'm just getting on with the job. I'm not staying awake worrying about the court action that's underway.
Yeah, I'm interested in your perspective. Did you welcome the intervention by the Prime Minister, or were you happy to face the pre-selectors in your branch?
I was happy to have a full pre-selection, and I'd like to think that I would have prevailed in those circumstances.
So why didn't that happen? Why didn't the Prime Minister... Did you try and talk the Prime Minister out of intervening?
I made clear to the party officials that I would have preferred a full pre-selection, but look, the PM's explained some of the thinking that was going through his mind. And
well, he said he was standing up for women. You're not a woman.
And there was a particular, not last time I checked, but there was a particular challenge that was happening in Farrer, which I think was exercising his mind, and I suspect that some of us have been caught in the slipstream of that. But look, the important thing... In hindsight,
do you think the democratic processes of the New South Wales branch should have been allowed to play out?
Look, they're the type of things I think we do need to reflect on after the election. I think one of the key lessons is that we do need to get on with pre-selections earlier. I think that's the expectation of the membership. In this business, and I've been around the party for a long time, there has always been an understanding that the leader of the day will particularly have an influence over key seats and marginal seats where there's going to be a contest. And I think also leaders traditionally try to make sure that problems, as it would have been a real problem if we'd had a senior female cabinet minister being seriously threatened in her seat, that the leader will try and sort out those problems.
Yeah, that's true, but they should have perhaps started that sorting out process a lot earlier.
That's the point I just made. made. I think that we have to start the pre-selection process earlier, and that's one of the lessons of what's happened over the last few months.
Senator Jim Molan, Liberal Senator, told us this week that he is worried that the rank and file might not turn out to help on polling day because, you know, of this federal intervention. Are you worried? Is that what...
Well, that's not my experience to date. I mean, I've had volunteers coming from all my party branches helping me during the campaign so far, and I'm very grateful for that support. My own Liberal Party branch in North Sydney met and reaffirmed its support for pre-selections in the future, but also without dissent endorsed and enthusiastically, I think was their words, enthusiastically endorsed me as their candidate. So I'm very grateful for the support of my local party members, and I think they recognise and see the work that I've been doing in the community and what I've delivered for the community and the strong representation I've provided in Parliament.
It couldn't have been a worse lead-in to an election campaign for the Liberal Party, really, could it? All this internal discontent being directed at the Prime Minister and being called all sorts of names from some within your own side. The polls show that the Prime Minister is not terribly popular at the moment with the broader electorate. Will you invite the Prime Minister to campaign with you in North Sydney?
Well, look, it's up to his schedule, and
would you like him to?
Generally, you get told that a Prime Minister's visiting your electorate. But
would you welcome?
I would welcome his involvement. I'd welcome other senior involvement. I was really thrilled to have Josh Frydenberg, the Treasurer, out with me yesterday, meeting small businesses and talking about the budget and the benefits of the budget for small businesses in my electorate as it is across the nation. So I think that having the involvement of senior ministers can be helpful. But at the end of the day, I always take the view that you've really got to run your own race, and for me, being a good local campaigner is being out there selling what you've achieved for your electorate and working hard to talk to voters.
It's my experience that people running for election generally would welcome, though, a visit by the Prime Minister alongside of them. That normally should be a positive.
And I said that I'd be delighted the Prime Minister wants to join me on the campaign.
What about Barnaby Joyce? Have you asked him to keep out of your seat, certainly, but the national debate? I mean, some in your electorate might, you know, not have an issue with you around the whole issue of climate, but they do have an issue with the whole the National Party seems to have had on the Liberal Party's climate policy.
Well, I'm not expecting to have Barnaby Joyce campaigning in North Sydney. And
what about the national debate generally?
And look, Barnaby and I took a very different view on climate change. I strongly supported and helped deliver our commitment to net zero emissions by 2050. For me, that's an important bookend to the journey that we have to go through and which we're already on. Barnaby took a different view. I'm pleased that the view that I had prevailed.
You are going to fighting, well, it's suggested, your seat's not actually a marginal seat, but you're fighting off a real serious challenge from one of the Climate 200-backed independents, Kylie Tink. 2 weeks ago at the UN, the Secretary-General accused Australia of being a holdout in the world because of the Morrison's government refusal to toughen Australia's 2030 emissions reduction target. How much is the Morrison government's climate policies hurting you and your electorate? How much is it a threat to you?
Well, I think it is an issue that is of very significant importance to residents in my electorate. It is an issue that's constantly raised with me and has been throughout my time in Parliament, and that's why I've been such a strong voice for pushing our ambition further. It's why I was such a strong voice.
Are you in danger because of the government's
for pushing it? I think residents recognise that it is important that there are people like me in the Liberal Party and the government that are arguing for greater ambition on climate change. It would be a sorry day for politics in this country if you saw one of the major parties without people like me and Dave Sharma and Katie Allen in Victoria, the list goes on, who have been very effectively pushing for more ambition. We did that on net zero. We did it on things like increasing funding for agencies like the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. We successfully campaigned to stop the paper leather licence being reissued off the coast of New South Wales. These are the things that we are delivering in government, and in that I'm reflecting both my own strong commitment to climate action but also the views of my electorate.
Just before we go, you're just recovering from a bout of COVID, actually, so I'm glad to have you here. But the Senate Select Committee into COVID has just released its final report just in the last little while. The headline finding is a recommendation that the next federal government establish a royal commission into the pandemic response. Is that a good idea?
Well, I've just had a quick look at the press release issued by Labor Senator Katie Gallagher. It's one of the most naked political documents documents I've seen, and if that's what the report's
in what sense?
like.
A Royal Commission?
If you look at the language involved in this press release, it is basically a political statement, not a serious analysis. But what I'd say is that, yeah, of course there's going to be lessons that we have to learn from this, and governments, including our own, made mistakes along the way. But overall, I actually think that Australia has, alongside New Zealand, been the most outstanding country in meeting the health and economic consequences of this crisis. And
so you don't support the idea of a Royal Commission in the pandemic response, something like $280 billion of spending or something?
Yeah. Well,
should we have a Royal Commission to see that we've done that well?
I think that we do need to look at what went well and what didn't, but we're still emerging from the pandemic. I'm not sure a Royal Commission's the best way in which to achieve that, but I wouldn't fall for Labor's trap of trying to besmirch the incredible effort of governments, both state and federal, backed by the people of Australia in a way that so many other jurisdictions didn't have, where Australians have so positively followed the health advice. And that's why we've been able to save 40,000 lives. That's why we've emerged from the worst pandemic-induced economic crisis with unemployment down to 4%. Australia, along with our cousins across the ditch, really have been, I think, the global standouts. And that's not an accident. That's by good government policies at all levels.
Trent Zimmerman, thank you very much for joining us. I know we're not in the official campaign yet, but you have taken time off the quasi-campaign trail to come and join us. Thank you.
Thanks, Fran. Thanks for having me.
Trent Zimmerman, the Liberal member for North Sydney. And Greg, Trent Zimmerman, they're having pretty significant whack at the Senate Select Committee on the COVID response. Their main recommendation calling for that Royal Commission, whoever's in government, to the pandemic response.
Yeah, exactly, Fran. And that does actually represent a sharpening of Labor's own position, because it's been taking decisive steps towards adopting just that as a policy, a full commitment to a Royal Commission. Now that they've actually injected it into a Senate committee report, I think we'll take it as read that that is firm and established Labor policy now, if they get the opportunity to call one. We might press on, because as absorbing, Fran, as domestic politics is, that's not the only game in town either at the moment, because before and since Vladimir Putin's brazen invasion of Ukraine, sanctions and foreign policy here in Australia have pretty much been strictly bipartisan. It still is, but one distinction is beginning to emerge now. Labor wants the government to do as many others in Europe have already done by kicking out Russian diplomatic staff working here in Australia. We are about to hear from Shadow Foreign Affairs spokeswoman Penny Wong, but here's how some senior Foreign Affairs Department officials explained their thinking on diplomatic expulsions at today's Senate estimates hearings.
Having a mechanism, not just Australia, but more broadly, mechanisms through which to have negotiations, to apply pressure, to call on the aggressor, in this case Russia, to withdraw troops, find a diplomatic off-ramp, negotiate peace, etc.
I don't think they want a diplomatic off-ramp, though, do they?
Well, they have withdrawn from Kiev, which is a good...
That's a strategic retreat.
Which
not
is
a
a good
diplomatic
sign.
off-ramp.
I would also say that we're in regular daily contact with like-minded countries, including the European countries you've mentioned, but also the United States, Canada and the UK, none of which have yet expelled diplomats.
With the Minister for Foreign Affairs in Brussels today, being able to talk to many of her counterparts, this is another opportunity to explore likely actions from like-minded countries.
And so this is very, very serious. It nearly sounds flippant to say, but is it appropriate to say watch this space?
The government has been clear that all actions remain on the table.
Well, straight from those estimates hearings that ran all week, Penny Wong joined us in the studio a few moments ago to discuss Russia and also some political developments closer to home. Penny Wong, welcome to the afternoon briefing studio. I think your first entry into the new look studio.
The new look background is pretty impressive.
Greatly revamped. Why don't I ask you about an evolving domestic political issue first of all, and that is that the High Court's agreed to consider this application by a disgruntled former, now New South Wales Liberal Party member, Matthew Cummins-Oley. Do you see any potential here for the court to throw a spanner in the works with the Prime Minister's election timetable?
Ultimately, that's a matter for the court. The court obviously is independent, but I'd make a point. You said he's a former Liberal. I think that's because he's been expelled as a consequence of taking them to court. And I'd make this observation. There are times where parties have to intervene in their branches federally because there's alleged corruption, like there was in the Victorian branch, and Anthony Albanese had to show that leadership. What seems to be occurring here, if you listen to the people who are concerned about it, is a concern that Mr Morrison intervened in order to impose his own candidates. And there's obviously a lot of concern about that, not just from this gentleman, but more broadly, including within some in the party in Canberra.
You're a lawyer. I think many are rating...
It's a long time.
Sure. Rating the prospects of the court actually taking on this case as somewhat remote. If they did, on paper at least, that would make the pathway towards a May 14 or 21 election more complicated.
Look, I'm not going to hypothesise about what the High Court might or might not do. You know, they're the highest court in the land, and they're obviously, we have a principle of the independence of the judiciary.
Sure.
But I would again make the point. The delay here is a delay right up to the wire that Mr Morrison and Mr Hawke, his advisor on this, to have deliberately engineered. So if there is a consequence to their election timetable, it is a consequence really of their own making. It is they who have engineered this timeframe.
Sure. OK, let's go to foreign affairs now, where you've spent a lot of time this week in Senate estimates. Now, you're calling for Russian diplomatic expulsions because you say, quote unquote, a line has been crossed. What is the line that's been crossed that warrants the opposition now to leap ahead of the government position?
And I understand why Marise Payne has taken the position she has prior to now, and you know, I've been supportive. I understand the pragmatic argument that we need to keep lines of communication open and so forth. But
so you didn't do this lightly?
Didn't do this lightly, but I would make this point. There must be a line a point at which we say we can no longer take this approach. And really, when you see the mounting horrific evidence of war crimes, whether it is the massacre in Bucha or other parts of the surrounds of Kiev, the mounting allegations or the mounting evidence of rape and sexual violence being used as a weapon of war, there does come a point where Australia has to say, we will do what other countries have done. So it's not unprecedented.
It's not.
A number of European countries, including Germany and France, have expelled Russian diplomats, not at ambassador level, but Russian diplomats. And I think it's come time for us to do so.
I think on the DFAT website it suggests there might be about 11 accredited Russian diplomats here in Australia. Do you have a figure in mind?
No, look, I think that is a matter for the government. I think the government should consider what is the appropriate response. My view, the opposition's view, Anthony's view, and I think the view of many Australians when we saw the graphic, horrific images and, as I said, mounting credible evidence of war crimes, we have to act.
But all of that was done at or around the time that these other countries, we haven't named them yet, but Italy, Denmark, Sweden, Spain, Latvia, Lithuania had moved into diplomatic expulsions. That then leads to the question, what difference would it make?
Oh, yeah, and where you have someone like Mr Putin who, for ideological and other reasons, is prepared to immorally and illegally invade a country, is prepared to engage in the sorts of atrocities we have seen, that's a reasonable question. But we can do what we can do, and we should do it.
Were the government to go there, and they might, the DFAT Secretary Catherine Campbell, who we just heard in an earlier piece, says that this might be something that's discussed by Marise Payne. Tit for tat would be entirely possible. Could that cripple or completely disable our own embassy operations in Moscow?
Well, these are amongst the considerations that government has to make around the scale of and number and level of diplomatic response. I did ask the Secretary today about contingency arrangements in place if Russia were the government to do this, or simply in response to sanctions to limit Australian representation in Moscow. I would make this point, the DFAT advice is do not travel to Russia currently.
Right, but there are 2,500 people.
I appreciate that, but I again want to reiterate that. There should be contingency arrangements in place, and that's what we asked about today.
Right.
But ultimately we have to decide, do we want to respond to what we've seen or not? If we do, why not? I also made the point, Australia did expel 2 diplomats as a result of the poisoning of the opposition.
Yep, you made that comparison, and we'll take it then as a given that if this government hasn't acted before caretaker, you certainly would if successful at the election in America.
We've made our view clear. We think it's time for diplomatic measures such as these to be taken.
All right, can we bring it closer to home? The Solomons, you spent a lot of time, again, questioning officials there. In all likelihood, what more could be done or would you do if Foreign Minister in a few weeks' time to counter these moves by China into the neighbourhood?
Well, first I'd make the point, whilst we do respect the right of Solomon Islands and every nation to make decisions about their own security, obviously, all parties in the region, whether it's Australia or Fiji or Papua New Guinea or a range of other Pacific Island nations, also have a right to talk about regional security and the importance of the Pacific family working together to ensure a secure region. The second point I'd make about Solomon Islands is we are a long way from where we would want to be.
So
we are a long way from where we'd want to be, and that is a consequence of many things, the strategic circumstances that you've alluded to. I think also we're not the partner of choice, obviously, that we would want to be, that we would always want to be.
Sogavare says it should remain partner number one.
Of course, and we need to ensure that in word and deed we demonstrate that.
So any practical measures that spring to mind straight off the bat?
I think that the reduction in development assistance, including to Solomon Islands in recent years, has been short-sighted and not in Australia's interests.
All right, no doubt we'll get to talk about that again.
Well, I think we should be. I've said repeatedly, we should be rebuilding our development assistance budget and we should be focusing it on our region.
Yep. 2 other quick ones that have come up, but one again from Estimates Processes. The Australian Future Leaders Foundation, it picks up $18 million. What did we learn or what did you extract from the government by way of due diligence before that $18 million was granted?
Well, it was... This was discussed in estimates and Labor senators, myself and Tim Ayres, asked questions about this. And what seems to be clear is money was paid and charitable status achieved in a very short time frame and apparently before what appears to be before anything's actually up and running. So
that's unusual?
That is unusual, and I think the government should explain why it is that we've got $18 million paid over to an entity which as yet doesn't seem to be operational.
And one last quick one, I think is breaking this evening, in fact, is that the Australian Human Rights Commission has gone through a periodic review of its status and effectively been downgraded due to some questionable commissioner appointments. What should result from that?
That's very deeply concerning. I think those reports were breaking as we walked in. Very deeply concerning. We are a country that has a strong international reputation on human rights. We should not allow that to be eroded. It diminishes our capacity to advocate for human rights globally if we're not seen to be doing the right thing in many ways, in any way at home. We've raised concerns previously about the funding of the Commission, appointment processes. I'm sure Mr Dreyfus will be making a full response to that.
Well, we'll seek comment from him and no doubt from Michaelia Cash as well. Penny Wong, thanks so much for joining us on Afternoon Briefing. Hopefully we'll get to have the experience again before too long.
Yeah, it's great to be with you.
Okay, so a big part of that discussion with Penny Wong just a little earlier did, of course, relate to sanctions and action generally to be taken against Russia. Labor's position is that diplomatic staff should be expelled. Now, probably around the time that we were holding that discussion, Marise Payne, the Foreign Minister, was in Brussels for a whole series of talks that are ongoing there, and she has emerged a very short time ago to announce yet another round of sanctions that will be applied on senior officials and oligarchs in the Putin regime. Here was Marise Payne in Brussels only minutes ago.
67 further sanctions of Russian elites and oligarchs, those close to Putin who facilitate and support his outrageous actions. The events we have seen uncovered in Bucha this week only reinforce the importance of strong global coordination in response to Russia for their actions.
All right, well, coming up, Anthony Albanese's moving on from Western Australia to South Australia this afternoon, so we'll step through some of the dominant federal issues with a panel of politicians from that state. But first, let's go to Fran in Sydney.
Already, a number of politicians from the Prime Minister down have been forced to isolate with COVID, and it's certain the virus will present significant challenges for all sides of politics during the election. In a moment, we'll be talking to some political strategists about how unseen events like COVID can derail a campaign. But first, I'm joined in the studio by the host of the ABC's Health Report and the Coronacast podcast, Dr. Norman Swan. Norman, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
Norman, every second politician I talk to, it feels like, is in isolation with COVID, or they've got it themselves, or their kids have it, something like that. What's the national COVID picture as we sit here on the eve of an election campaign?
Well, this is the worst year of the pandemic. You might not think so, but it is, in terms of number of cases and number of deaths. And at various points, the number of deaths, they seem to be moving around a little bit, maybe going down a little bit at the moment, but every 14 days or 16 days, it's the equivalent of a 737 crash. So it's a lot of people dying of COVID. And they've just changed, they're changing the way they report. They're going to stop reporting COVID deaths. OK,
so there's more deaths, that many deaths, that's a lot of deaths, the worst year, yet we're not reporting the numbers in the same way, we're not focusing on the numbers in the same way. Does that suggest the community's not worried about it in the same way, and therefore it's unlikely to be any kind of factor in the election? Wasn't a couple of months ago we were talking about the election could be a referendum on the pandemic?
Well, it may be partly a referendum on the pandemic. I think that the immediate effect is that the population, the public, are fed up. They're fed up with lockdown, masks and everything else, and they're tired of it. If you look at the 1918 flu pandemic, 1920 was the worst year for the same reason. People stopped wearing their masks, were getting fed up with it, and it was a bad year. And we were going through a bad year. I think the political implications of COVID are not so much what's happening now, although if something bad happened, it could have an impact. But what's likely to happen is there'll be a lull towards the end of April into the election period, and there won't be very much COVID around at that point. What the problem for the government is that traditionally, regardless of the colour of the government, pandemics and crises have not been good for incumbents when the crises have passed. Churchill lost power in the Second World War. After the 1918 pandemic, lots of governments changed. You've seen the situation in South Australia, Premier Gutwein resigning, and it's likely that people remember what happened before, and it's the lingering memory that I think might have a political impact.
I think the government's banking on what it sees as its good news message, that Australia has one of the highest vaccination rates in the world, Australia has one of the lowest death rates in the world from COVID, Australia's economy has bounced back, one of the quickest recovering economies in the world after COVID. And I think they're feeling pretty good about that message getting through to the public. Do you think the public's receiving that message?
It's hard to know. I think people have just moved on and feeling tired. But if you're a parent of a young kid and you've had that child's been sent home and you've been on homeschooling, and that's not receiving publicity, and a lot of parents are losing time at work and looking after their children, I think young parents are seeing the impact, and probably grandparents as well. So there is an undercurrent going on at the moment, which is having an impact and not being fully reported. So I'm not sure that the mood in the community is as good as the politicians hope that it would be. Yeah, we have done well. Certain things have fallen apart, but there are people at the moment still suffering.
So we're heading into an election campaign, minimal restrictions really in all states now with COVID. How vulnerable are Australians to reinfection, and how might that play into a campaign?
Look, the BA2 surge has been quite considerable, and a lot of people have been infected. So if the only thing around is Omicron, so either BA1 or BA2, you might see a surge going into winter, but it's unlikely you'll see another rise before the election unless a new variant comes in. And even if a new...
And what are the chances of that? What's the new variants on the horizon?
It's unpredictable, you just don't know. Somebody gets off a plane with a new variant. But even if a new variant came in, unless it was super contagious, well, it will be super contagious to actually muscle out the others, it's unlikely to have a huge impact before the election, but there will be worries about it. This is just totally unpredictable. The pandemic is not over, and we need to be highly vigilant. And what's important politically is, I think, the decision announced by the Chief Health Medical Officer, Paul Kelly, the other day, to stop reporting COVID deaths. It's just too much of a coincidence that that's coming out 2 or 3 days before the announcement of an election, where you're not going to get reporting of COVID deaths. You're going to get reporting of excess mortality, which might in the long run be the right thing. So in other words, how many people, added people, are dying in the community that wouldn't otherwise...
How many more people than usual?
But to be stopping reporting, what actually winds people up is the reporting on a daily basis. And I suspect the government finds it convenient not to be reporting on daily COVID deaths.
Norman, thanks very much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Well, there's certainly plenty of COVID about, as Norman was just telling us, but what impact is that likely to have, if any, on this election campaign? I'm joined now by Ben Oakwist, Executive Director of the Australia Institute, and from Hawaii, Bruce Hawker, former Labor strategist and founder of Hawker Britain. Ben Oakwist and Bruce Hawker, welcome both of you.
Thanks, Fran. Hi, Bruce.
And Bruce, perhaps I should say aloha to you.
Aloha.
Let me start with you, Bruce. We know Labor has wargamed a scenario where Anthony Albanese gets COVID, but how big a blow would it be for Labor's campaign if their leader comes down with COVID and has to isolate for a week? What if it's the last week of the campaign?
Well, the important thing here, Fran, is that they have wargamed it, and campaigning is all about preparation for the unexpected. And of course, in this case, it's probably expected that there could be COVID in the leadership of the Labor Party. Anthony Albanese hasn't had it yet, and hopefully he won't have it. So what happens then? I suspect that what would transpire is that the campaign would click into another sort of a mode where he would be commenting from Zoom like I am now and leading the campaign in that way.
Sure, but that's a long way from being out on the hustings and hugging babies and all the rest of it, isn't it? I mean, you've worked on a lot of campaigns. Have you seen a campaign blighted by bugs before?
I've seen lots of campaigns blunted, and it's a real problem. The thing here, though, I think we need to be conscious of is that most people understand that what it's like to get COVID. You know, a large percentage of the Australian population has had it now. Their members of their family have had it. We've all been affected by it in some way. So it's not all that unusual for the leader or a prime minister to have COVID and for life to go on, even in a campaign. Okay. I don't see it as being hugely significant, but it's something which they're planning for, and I think that's the most important thing.
Ben Oakwist, I imagine both sides are planning for this, but how do you see this campaign being affected by COVID? Do you think it's likely to change much?
In the chat
well, two things. One, there's for the politicians, and the risks there are, one, that you get a COVID outbreak at campaign HQ, or more significantly probably, and there's already talk that, you know, the Labor's had some in their campaign HQ, but they've probably got war games to plan for that, and they can. We've all got used to working on Zoom at home. But the more significant risk is you get an outbreak in your travelling party of the leader and the leader itself. And yes, there'll be war games for how to deal with that. Lots of Zoom press conferences and the like, but also plans for your high-profile spokespeople. You just had Penny Wong on there. If there was a press conference scheduled for South Australia, Penny Wong would likely be fronting it. If there was a press conference that was scheduled for Queensland, perhaps Jim Chalmers would be confronting it. So a mixture of Zoom and a mixture of relying on your other high-profile leaders. And probably Morrison thinks he's had COVID, he's less susceptible to getting it, but as we've seen from the health advice, you can get it again. And I think probably the risks are as much on the Morrison side of COVID derailing him if he got infected and had to isolate than Labor. It's a very centralised campaign around Morrison. There's a lot of pressure on him to deliver. So maybe slightly more risk on his side. Then there's the punters, how the punters deal with voting in a COVID election. And we've seen that big increase in pre-poll and postal votes over recent years, and I expect that trend to continue this time. I mean, it used to be back in 1993, I think 90% of people voted ordinary on election day. That's dropped to 54%. And this could be the first election where you get less than 50% of the population voting ordinarily. Interestingly, just finally, we haven't seen from the AEC what provisions they're going to be put in place for people who actually have COVID as voters and who are having to isolate. There were provisions put in South Australia to deal with that, but the AEC says they're not going to announce it until the campaign starts. Some kind of provision to allow people to get a postal vote from a testing centre if they're isolating or a close contact, perhaps.
Yeah, they'll have to bring in something. Ben, just to stay with you for one moment longer about that, talking about how people might cast their vote, but what about how it might affect their vote, the whole COVID issue? You've done some polling, I think, where you've been asking people, tracking people, which level of government they blame or credit for a COVID response.
Yeah, clearly, a big picture, I've put the election campaign down to this, is that Anthony Albanese wants to make this a referendum on Scott Morrison and his handling of the pandemic, and Scott Morrison wants to make this a referendum on whether Albanese is good enough to be Prime Minister. And on Albanese's side, he's got this weight of public opinion, and we've been tracking it, that shows a huge gap. When voters are asked which level of government has done a better job of handling COVID, overwhelmingly people back their states as handling it better. So that's the headwind that we've been tracking that for the best part of 2 years, and that gap has kind of grown and now solidified in people thinking it's their state that handled it better than the federal level of government. So that's the COVID headwind that the Prime Minister confronts.
OK. Bruce, if we can put COVID under the banner of known unknowns, what about completely unknowns like the guy at the pub or, you know, the open-air press conference? Since we've had both of those, let's have a look.
Question, are you up for it?
I'm absolutely up for it.
OK, good.
And sorry, we can't really do that.
I don't think the media will mind at all. I've said, are you up for it? Are you up for it?
I'm absolutely up for it.
Are you up for it?
I'm here to do a press conference for the press. We can chat with you afterwards, mate.
This is what you said when you got elected last time. We're going to help all those people that worked all their lives, paid their taxes, and those that have a go will get a go.
Correct.
Well, I've had a go, mate. I've worked all my life and paid my taxes.
Bruce Hooker, how do leaders prepare for these kind of interruptions, disruptions? Do they assume they're going to happen? And how do you rate the way both Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese have dealt with these first hurdles on their campaign trail?
Well, at the outset, I'd say I've got some grudging respect for those people that are prepared to front up to leaders and give them their candid opinions, even though we hate it in a campaign when it happens because it's an uncontrollable moment, and campaigns are about trying to control the narrative. It happens in every campaign. I think it'll continue to happen in this one. I think it's harder for Scott Morrison because basically he's got more to answer for to the electorate in many people's minds. You know, COVID, the bushfires and so forth. They're problems which he has still to answer for. And I think a lot of people are unhappy about a lot of the leadership issues. So the incumbent always struggles a bit more, I think, than the challenger when it comes to these sorts of things. But I'd say also on a more general point that while we're talking about COVID in an election campaign, whether it's from his sick bed as the opposition leader or the Prime Minister, or when we're talking about policy, it's not good for Scott Morrison. he really needs to get off COVID as an issue and move on to his stronger points. And so whilst we're talking about it, it is not a good issue for him. And it's a strength for Anthony Albanese, for sure.
Ben Oaquist, did you have a look at how Anthony Albanese handed that interloper to his press conference? Because there's been a little bit of talk around criticism that perhaps Anthony Albanese doesn't manage too well when there's a bit of a media pack having a go at him, or, you know, that he's not really been tested on that level.
Yeah, well, the Prime Minister's gone through an election campaign as a leader and Anthony Albanese hasn't, so that's a disadvantage to him. And you do have to learn how to deal with events as they come up in an election campaign. It's really important. I'm always quoting that quote of Mike Tyson, which everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And the leaders need to cope with mistakes or interruptions as they come up. But the key thing is, do those interruptions or events or crises or missteps feed into an existing narrative that's a problem for either leader? And Scott Morrison copped that last night when he had a punter tackling him on cost of living and his failure to deliver a National ICAC or Integrity Commission to existing problem narratives for the Prime Minister. And interestingly, the Prime Minister tried to create the problem narrative for Albanese today when he talked about this interruption that Albanese had. And the Prime Minister said, you see, Albanese won't ask, he hasn't asked questions for the last 3 years and he won't answer them now. So the Prime Minister effectively trying to impose his narrative on the misstep, the supposed misstep that Anthony Albanese had. So it's one, how you react to those problems or interruptions, and two, whether they feed into an existing narrative or problem narrative for you. Like what happened to Mark Latham with that handshake. Voters already had worries about him being up to the job, and that confirmed it.
Oh yes, that handshake. Ben, just before I let you go, you mentioned the leaders earlier and how the state leaders, the premiers, are by and large getting credit for having dealt with COVID well. They've played a very high-profile role on the national stage in the last couple of years. Do you think the popularity of the premiers is going to have any impact, any bearing on this federal election? Normally they're quite separate, but do you see it differently this time?
Yeah, I can't see how it won't have some impact on the campaign. I mean, the role of the premiers and their popularity has transformed Australian politics over the last 2 years. They've been the household names. And you've seen Albanese sticking like glue to McGowan over there in Western Australia, hoping that those high polls that are coming out from Western Australia rub off on him and stay true. He's in South Australia today, hugely popular new premier there in Malinauskas. I don't know if anyone saw him at the press club yesterday delivering kind of an Obama-style speech that's gone down very well. So I think the premiers are going to have a much bigger role. And some of them, from both sides of politics, want to attack the Prime Minister. And he ends up being not just against one opposition leader, but, you know, against potentially 8.
Okay.
And I think that will play into the campaign.
And just, Bruce, a quick one by you, from you. Labor has most of the premiers and chief ministers. Will they be lining them up, trying to help, you know, give some ballast to Anthony Albanese?
Look, I think they will, and for the reasons that Ben outlined, this has been a state-dominated couple of years, really, and they've done pretty well, with the exception of South Australia, and I think South Wales to some extent too, where COVID is a very significant problem. So I'm not sure how much Morrison will be able to benefit from having Dom Perrottet in his corner in New South Wales. So all that sort of shapes up much better for Albanese, I think, than it does for Morrison. More reason why Morrison needs to get away from COVID as an issue and onto other stronger points for him.
All right, Bruce Hawker, Ben Oaquist, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, Fran. Thanks, Bruce.
Pleasure.
Okay, time now for our political panel, and today we're focusing on South Australia. Liberal MP James Stephens and Labor Senator Marielle Smith are with us, both of them in Adelaide today. Welcome back. As we just heard in the previous discussion, the campaign caravan, at least on your side, Marielle, is coming to town in Adelaide. But South Australia doesn't find itself as a hotbed of marginal seats this time around, does it? I mean, best prospect, number of seats in play, what, probably 1 in the seat of Boothby?
Look, Boothby is obviously a really competitive seat. We've got a great candidate there in Louise Miller-Frost. But I think we saw in the state election certainly a mood to change, a mood for a message which was more hopeful and a mood towards something better and something different. And because of that, I don't think we should underestimate the strength of Labor candidates in other seats, and of course the strength of our Senate candidates too, where, you know, that will be a hotly contested race as well.
Yeah, and James, last time I think we spoke to you on this program, the dust had barely settled on the state election result. It might have been a bit early to get an assessment of the crossover. You've since gone home. In what way have those state themes carried over, do you think, into your own electorate and others around Adelaide?
Look, Greg, I think there's certainly a lesson to be learned for the Liberal Party in the state result in South Australia a few weeks ago. I don't know that the issues are going to carry over into the federal election. I mean, it was bitterly disappointing for the Liberal Party to lose the South Australian state election, but we lost on very defined state-based issues, particularly the health system, ambulances and ramping. Those are important issues, but they won't feature as prominently as they did in the South Australian state election. So I think there'll be very different issues at play in the federal election. I'm looking forward to having that debate and those arguments with Marielle and others in the opposition over the coming weeks.
Well, why don't we drill into one of those, Marielle? Defence industry, specifically ship and submarine building. Is it essential for South Australians that both sides state explicitly how much of the submarines are going to be built right there in South Australia? There seems a high degree of ambiguity from everyone involved so far when it comes to these nuclear subs.
Look, that's exactly right, Greg, and it builds on years and years of ambiguity and uncertainty for my state when it comes to the submarine build. You know, we originally had the Liberals promising something like 25,000 jobs in our state because of their submarine commitments. This year alone, we've lost more than 400 jobs. We had uncertainty around full cycle docking. Now we have uncertainty around what the new program will look like, what will be built in South Australia, what the local content will be, and what it means for jobs. And workers in particular are just fed up with it. They want certainty. They want to know what the future of their industry looks like in our state. And
which is reasonable, Marielle, but is it reasonable to be getting answers this side of an election? I mean, I know last time with the French boats, it got down to actual percentages, you know, will locally made be 80 or 65 or whatever. Is it reasonable to get those sort of pledges here? Because we don't know much about these nuclear subs, do we?
Well, what is reasonable is for the Liberals to come out and say, yes, we're committed to these jobs in South Australia and we will be transparent and frank with the South Australian people, which they haven't been. And I'll just make the point, Greg, you know, these jobs aren't just about the direct jobs on the submarine program. This also affects workers in small and medium-sized enterprises who hope to have contracts or other opportunities from the program. And it goes to business confidence in our state too, which affects the broader economy. This uncertainty has gone on for so long. There's been a lack of transparency and there's just been failed promise after failed promise.
Yeah, James, on that point, what are you looking for? Because you know, in a previous life were heavily involved in trying to extract every last job from defence industry for South Australia. It's quite a different discussion we're rolling into now, though, about these submarines. Do you actually think we'll get any clear answers, you know, in the next 3 to 5 years?
Well, the clear answer is that we're building the next fleet of submarines here in Adelaide, like we are the future frigates.
All of
them?
Also
upgrading the Collins-class submarine, the full-cycle docking, which the Labor Party and Mark McGowan tried to take away from Adelaide, but the Liberal government has secured those jobs. The submarine program has been beset by delay dating back to the previous Labor government making no decision on acquiring submarines. We've rapidly progressed that, and now we have a new exciting opportunity to get nuclear-propelled submarines, which is an unbelievable capability for the Royal Australian Navy, and the construction of those submarines is going to be here in Adelaide. That's what the Liberal government has delivered, and it would be good to have Labor supporting that and committing to it too.
But could we find, James Stephens, that we discover, like the French, oh, you can't build the nose cone or the periscope or this part or that, it has to be brought in? I mean, that's entirely feasible, isn't it, in this project?
No, I think we already know that clearly the nuclear propulsion, you know, the reactor and components will be brought in, but the rest of the ship, a pressure hull has to be assembled all together, and that will happen in Adelaide. There's no question about that, and that's the commitment that we've made. Adelaide will be getting thousands of jobs for decades to come in submarines, and thanks to other decisions we've made in naval shipbuilding, that extends to the frigate program and the upscaling of the Collins class as well. So we're delivering thousands of jobs here thanks to our commitment to naval shipbuilding.
All right, look, on related issues, I suppose, the Ukraine war, we are having this discussion today. We heard from Penny Wong, Marielle, about a Labor position, which is to move on to diplomatic expulsions now. We've had further sanctions announced while we've been going to air, Marielle, on Russian senior oligarchs and leadership. How much further do you think this has got to run, and will it become in any way politicised by Labor moving ahead of the government today?
Look, I think whenever I talk to South Australians about what is happening in Ukraine, they're absolutely horrified and distressed by the scenes which are unfolding there, and they want to make sure that their government is doing everything it can to stand in solidarity with the people of Ukraine, as we should. I mean, what Anthony Albanese has proposed here is about being in lockstep with our European partners and making sure that we're acting together with our allies to be most effective in standing in solidarity with the Ukrainian people. And I think that's what South Australians would expect of their government, that we stand with our friends and that we stand up for the people of Ukraine.
Yep. James, on that, are you troubled at all by, it's only a slight move ahead of the government position by the opposition? Do you think you might get there yourselves before too long?
Well, we've made very tangible commitments of support to the Ukraine. Obviously, President Zelensky made his request to the Parliament this time last week, and we're meeting that request for the Bushmaster capability to be airlifted there to the Ukraine. Other things, including sanctions that we've put in place, have been in lockstep, and I think it's important that we maintain bipartisanship on this issue. I don't think the people of Australia want to see point scoring on suggestions that may or may not be sensible based on internal diplomatic advice that I don't have access to, Marielle doesn't have access to, people don't have access to publicly. I want to see us focus on achieving real outcomes, not playing politics with this issue. All
right. Well, it sounds like you're both going to have a full dance card for electoral activity there. The question is when. I guess it's a matter of days. But we're going to leave our discussion there, and who knows, maybe get a chance to reconvene before election day is upon us. Marielle Smith and James Stevens joining us, both of them from Adelaide. Now, before we go today, let's recap that breaking news from a little earlier, just touched on in part in our previous discussion. Foreign Minister Marise Payne has announced 67 further sanctions against Russian elites and oligarchs while the minister's attending NATO talks in Brussels. The Foreign Minister added the events we have seen uncovered in Bucha this week only reinforce the importance of strong global coordination in response to Russia for their actions. Journalists and human rights observers have documented what appear to be mass graves and bodies of civilians lining streets following Russia's withdrawal from Bucha and other towns to the north and west of Kyiv throughout this week. So that was Marise Payne's latest contribution during those diplomatic talks there in Belgium. Now, we're almost done for afternoon briefing today. Fran and I will both be back again tomorrow. It is expected, as we flagged at the outset of our coverage today, that the High Court will be contemplating a question brought by a disgruntled former Liberal Party member from New South Wales. That is, whether it should take a full look as an actual case at the complaint about federal intervention in the New South Wales branch. That's the only question the court has to clear, first of all, whether to take on the case, and then if it did decide to, then that would be a hearing that would have to be held subsequently into next week, you would have to imagine. What that means for Scott Morrison and his election timing calculations is anyone's guess, and certainly resides only in the mind of the Prime Minister until he decides to take that trip to Yarralumla. But in any event, we'll be back and we'll cover that hearing as best we can, amongst other issues of the day on Afternoon Briefing. That's tomorrow. Fran and I back with you then. See you.
Make France great again.
This election is not just about who'll be the French president for the next 5 years. It is much more than that.
The march to the far right.
We have a history, we have a